listener, and welcome to another edition of the Coco and Daltz podcast. Welcome to our world of real people doing real reviews. Stuff on Amazon Prime and Netflix and Disney Plus and HBO Max and Jimmy's video store down the corner.
You made that joke last time, and
I know, but I'm consistent.
Okay.
I'm keeping going with that because we're gonna eventually Jimmy's gonna come up with a video and we're gonna do it. He's gonna stream something.
I hope it's not like the Tommy Lee, Pam Anderson video from the 90s, because I really don't want to see that.
I'm not Coco.
And I'm not Daltz.
And this week we are talking on this episode of the podcast. What are we talking about, Coco? And I'll help you with the title if you want me to.
Okay, it's a brand new Netflix original documentary. It's 90 minutes long, and it's called
Crack, Cocaine, Corruption, and Conspiracy.
That's right. It's a documentary about the crack epidemic of the 80s.
Oh, was I guessing? I didn't realize I was guessing.
You've won a new car!
You want some crack?
It just dropped on Netflix on Monday. We are recording this on Wednesday. We did actually watch it on Monday, but we just didn't get around to podcasting it till today.
We were doing research.
That's right, with our crack research team. Crack research team. No pun intended.
I was hoping you would do that.
Pun intended, actually. So it is exactly about what the title implies. It's about the crack epidemic of the 80s, how all this cocaine came flooding into America from Central America, how it led to the militarization of police forces across the country, how it led to the 1994 crime bill, which is much reviled and which Joe Biden got a lot of crap about during the recent presidential campaign. It talked to quite a few former addicts, talked about the influence the drug had, well, bad times like the drug caused them to have. So Daltz, what did you think about crack? I'm just going to shorten it and just call it crack.
I think that's a good idea. I can tell you, here's some things that this is not about. Crack, the documentary, is not about a TV repairman.
No.
It's not about Knuckles.
No.
And it's not really uplifting.
Well, no. Not at all.
And it's about an hour and a half long on Netflix, as you mentioned. I don't know. I thought it was fine. It had a lot of really good archival video. It had interviews with former dealers, including a dealer named Styles, not to be confused with
Harry Styles
or Furious Styles from Boys in the Hood, who was played by Lawrence Fishburne back in the day. And also some, how shall we say, some interviews with some crack ladies of the crack, who were...
I think you might want to just stop right there and just move on to your next point.
So there were a lot of people involved, a lot of people who were affected by crack in this particular area of New York. And it was largely in New York.
Yeah.
The interviews and this, the director... he was from New York area, so it was focused a lot on that area. But even though...
I feel like you're struggling. I feel like you're really struggling to give your opinion on this.
I gave my opinion off the top, and it was like, yeah, it's fine. It was fine. It was a documentary about crack. I mean...
Yeah, what you gonna do?
It didn't really blow me away. Maybe you can save this podcast by giving a more... eloquent opinion of what you think.
Oh, I doubt that. It was informative for me. I was a very little kid in the 80s, so obviously I knew that crack was a drug, but I wasn't touched by it in any way. I didn't realize the socioeconomic implications. I didn't realize, I knew that our prison population here in the States is out of control, but I didn't realize that as a direct result of the crack epidemic, it grew from 300,000 inmates in 1984 to over 2 million today. I didn't realize that's a direct result. I didn't realize this is what led to the militarization of the police. So there was, I was a little kid when Iran-Contra happened, so I barely remember hearing about Oliver North, but a couple years ago I listened to a podcast that really went into detail about what it was all about, and I don't remember that podcast at all mentioning the link between the CIA and the U.S. government turned a blind eye to all the cocaine that the Nicaraguans were bringing into the U.S. as a result of them trying to aid the Contras in overthrowing the Sandinistas. Like, I don't remember that being part of the podcast at all. So a lot of this for me was brand new information. It's 90 minutes long and it's very dense. Like, it is, even though
it feels longer than 90.
It feels longer than 90, and even like it's just packed with interviews and stuff. I feel like this is a subject they probably could have done a multi-part docu-series on.
Yeah.
And then, because there was just a lot of information, and it was good information if you're like me and you just basically don't know anything about this subject whatsoever. But yeah, it's a lot to get through. It's very, very dense, like I said.
You can only imagine what the cutting room floor looks like. I mean, they're not cutting anything anymore, but the digital cutting room floor in this, there's probably acres and acres and hours of cut video from this. They did so many interviews. They did so much research on it. Circling back to what you were talking about with the prison population, there's one thing that I will contest, is that they said that the prison population in 1980 was 300,000, I think you said, and it's 2 million now. I was like, what's the population increase since 1980? Like, I don't really think that that's actually much of a number. I mean, I'm not discounting the effect that the crack epidemic had on the prison populations, everything like that, but you're probably looking at per capita about the same amount of people being in prison compared to 1980. I mean, I haven't done the math on it.
Well, we have the highest prison population of any country in the world,
right,
including China and other countries that have more population.
Within that particular statistic, it just seemed a little bit misleading. It's like, what was the population of the United States in 1980? I mean, it wasn't 340 million or whatever it is now. So anyway, that's a minor point. I think this was really well done in some ways, but it just, I don't know, it just didn't do anything for me. It just, I came out of it on the other side thinking, yeah, that was fine. I mean, we've watched more entertaining and more informative documentaries, I think.
Well, just we knew going in that this was not going to be, the history of cuss words or whatever it was with Nicolas Cage. Like, this is an entirely different variety of documentary than that.
Absolutely. So. And it's dry, and then maybe it's good that it was only an hour and a half long, because
right,
more would have been harder to get through. I mean, it's very tragic. I mean, see these people who had gone through all these things and had been addicted to crack and all the things that they lost, and it's just tragic.
And when you have a penal system that's focused on, well, somebody's got to make money, so we're going to throw these people,
right,
in prison, like, lock them up and throw away the key, as opposed to rehabilitation. Like, one lady said that she was in prison 6 times for possession, and never once was she offered a chance at going to rehab instead, or, maybe going to a halfway house and doing some kind of community service. She was just locked up. And I'm like, well, there's your like school to prison pipeline right there. Like, in this country, it's all about the almighty dollar, and somebody's got to get rich. And if we can do that with privatized prisons, which is like the most disgusting thing I've ever heard of, then, that's why we're locking all these people up instead of trying to get them rehab. But I mean, there's a fine line between locking somebody up with like mental health issues, and forcing them to like take drugs. I mean, where's the line there? I don't know.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, that's exactly the struggle, is how many times do you step in and help somebody out? I mean, it sounds like none of these people were really helped out. So I think that's a different story. But in today's society, like how many times you try to help somebody out before they refuse to help themselves out, and then you've got no other choice. I mean, that's a really large issue, and that's a challenge, I think, right across this country, no matter where you're talking about. Like the things that they do in Europe and Scandinavia with the compassionate prison sentences and things like that, and these, like, they're almost like country clubs in some ways, some of these prisons in Scandinavia, but it seems to work.
Are you saying that because we watched that one
yes,
tennis pseudo documentary with Andy Samberg, where he was locked up in a Swedish prison, and it was like a country club with like orgies all day?
No,
is that what you're basing your
I had forgotten about that until you just mentioned it, but it was another documentary that we saw that we were talking about Scandinavian prisons, and it was all I remember is these guys sitting at a picnic bench looking over the beautiful fjord, and they're having lunch, and it was like this, and there were no fences, and there were no walls, and there were no guards.
Like, that's better than my life today, and I'm free,
Exactly.
Right.
Like rent free. But it's compassion. That's what comes first in some of these other countries, and it doesn't seem like it's that way at all here. And it seems like you mentioned, Coco, it's all about the mighty buck. Like, let's make some money first, and then go from there and see what happens.
Yeah. So I felt really bad for who knows how, yeah, like you said, like who knows how many interviews they have that they didn't include. Like, because it was at least probably a dozen former users and dealers they talked to. So who knows how many other people they interviewed and they just didn't have time for it because they had to keep it 90 minutes. Like I said, this is one I think it could have benefited from being like maybe chopped up, like a 4 or 6 part docu-series where maybe each episode is like in the 45-minute range, like where they could have really like done a deep dive in each episode on this is how crack came about. Like this is the background of, you know,
the chemical background.
Yeah, the chemical background. And like, you know, this is why cocaine was so popular in the 80s. And, you know, this is the socioeconomic stuff with like, you know, the inner city not being able to afford it, but wanting it and blah, blah, blah. So I think they could have really done a series on this, but yeah, it was a lot.
They did touch on a lot of that stuff that you're mentioning. I mean, they did mention some of those origins and things like that, but it was so quick and it was so, like, I agree with you. It would have been very easy to dive down in some of those topics. I think also, though, from my perspective, it's sort of the same as I started watching the Immigration Nation docu-series on Netflix, and I had to bail on it because it was just so sad. It was just so tragic, and it's not, you don't necessarily want to be watching puppies and flowers all the time. It doesn't have to be happy, joy. But,
I do. I say as I make you watch like Murder in Paradise. I
was going to say, when have we watched a puppy thing? I don't remember that. But I realize you got to watch the truth, and the truth sometimes hurts. And that's one of these things is like, man, this is such a hard topic and such a depressing topic that I don't think I could sit through 4 to 6 episodes of a docuseries on it. Like I'm glad it's about an hour and a half, 2 hours long would be probably the top end of it.
Yeah, you'd have to break that up. If it were like 4 episodes, 45 minutes each, you'd definitely have to break it up into like 2 one day and 2 another because you couldn't get through it all in the same day.
Yeah. And I wouldn't do more than one of these because that's just too intense. And the same thing, like I said, with the Immigration Nation, it was just too hard to see these people struggling, you know, over and over again to get back to their country and their families and everything like that. So the same thing with the drug addiction is like these people had, you know, didn't have great lives at the time, but they certainly were not addicted to a drug that just sent them spiraling onto the streets and all their material goods were gone. And a couple of the mothers were, you know, selling their babies off for crack and stuff like that. Like it's just awful. You can't even imagine what it must be like to be in that position. So,
and the people who are responsible for that, like the CIA letting the Nicaraguans, you know, bring cocaine into the country, like those guys aren't going to prison.
Yeah.
You know, they're going to have no consequences whatsoever. It's the person who got busted with one rock, who got sent to prison for what, like 8 to 40 years or something. I think they said one person got like a possession rap for like up to 40 years or something, which is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Like, you know, the people in power are never going to face any consequences. It's always the people, you know, at the bottom of the food chain that are going to get screwed. Well,
I thought it was interesting too, is that one guy who was a dealer and they interviewed him at the time. So back in the 80s, and he said, I'll sell a rock to my mother. I'll sell a rock to my friend. And, you know, I don't care if it's a baby, I'll sell a rock to it. Like this mentality that they had bought into it because the money was just unbelievable.
Right.
The money, the bankrolls that were coming in for this stuff. And some of the very interesting footage, me growing up in suburban Canada, very coddled in some ways, you know, seeing it was almost like drive-through lineups of people pulling up in these poor areas of New York buying drugs. And just like guys would walk up to the windows and toss some drugs in, they'd get some money out and the cars would go. And it was just mind-boggling that this kind of thing was going on.
It's like how you see in TV and movies now with like a car pulling up to the curb and there's like 5, you know, hookers over and standing by the building and one comes up and she's like, hey, honey. You know, it's reminiscent of that.
It was very similar to that. So you can only imagine. I mean, I know that sort of thing still goes on in some corners of the world, but it was just really eye-opening to see that was something that was happening in New York in the 80s. It was just unfathomable.
New York in the 70s and 80s was a actual hellhole. So you know, not too far-fetched. So what grade would you give crack?
I would give crack probably 6 vials. I think that
6 rocks up.
It doesn't seem appropriate to
no,
give it. Yeah,
definitely not.
Maybe just 6
stars.
6 stars.
Yeah.
What would you give it, Coco?
I give it like a B-.
Yeah.
It was informative, but it was really, there was a lot of information for the amount of time. And I think it could have actually benefited from busting up into like multiple episodes instead of just one. I would have appreciated a deeper dive into lots of the aspects of this. So
I'm thinking that you liked it more than I did.
well, a B- is about what, like about a 7.9 or like an 8.1 on a 10 scale, and you gave it a 6. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, unless you had anything else to add, we could probably wrap this version of the podcast up.
I have nothing else to add. So until next time, I'm not Daltz.
And I'm not Coco.